The headquarters of Argontech, a gleaming tower of glass and steel nestled in the heart of downtown Chicago, awoke each weekday to a symphony of ambition. Clacking heels echoed down marble floors, elevator chimes signaled non-stop vertical journeys of executives moving from one crisis to another, while the subtle hum of caffeine machines in every corner fueled dreams, deadlines, and a culture of relentless innovation. Men and women in meticulously tailored suits typed with urgency, spoke into headsets with intensity, and held brief meetings that sometimes decided the fate of million-dollar deals within minutes. In this charged environment, few noticed the quieter movements that took place in the dim hours before sunrise, the faint sound of a mop bucket wheeling past the marketing department, the gentle clink of a trash bin being emptied, or the brief flash of a reflective safety vest caught in the corner of someone's peripheral vision. Among the faceless night crew was Grace Mwangi, a janitor assigned to the 17th through 22nd floors, a woman who, though her ID badge read only custodial staff, carried a lifetime of stories no one ever asked to hear. Tall, graceful, and always wearing a reserved expression, Grace arrived every evening precisely at 9:45 p.m., clocked in without fuss, and disappeared into the heart of the building with her cart of supplies. Her co-workers thought her quiet, polite, perhaps a little distant, just another immigrant trying to survive. Few noticed the way she handled everything with care, from the glass boardroom tables she cleaned until they gleamed like ice, to the way she rearranged chairs with geometric precision, or how she never left a single fingerprint on the chrome fixtures in the executive washrooms. But Grace carried with her something far more valuable than work ethic or punctuality. In the stillness of the building after hours, when the noise of ambition had faded and only the whisper of air vents remained, Grace would begin to speak. Not to anyone but to herself, in a voice just loud enough to chase the silence. She would recite passages from her favorite books, poems from her childhood, and proverbs her grandmother used to say while cooking maize back home in Nakuru. But she didn't speak in only one tongue. Her voice flowed from Swahili to French, from Mandarin to Arabic, sometimes in the same sentence, sometimes while quoting Shakespeare or translating a policy memo someone had carelessly tossed in a bin. Russian rolled off her tongue like a native speaker. Spanish came with a Colombian lilt she had picked up from a former roommate, Portuguese with the elegance of Lisbon academia, and Hindi with the smooth filmic cadence she had mastered, watching subtitled Bollywood dramas during long nights in a refugee shelter. And of course English, the accent crisp and neutral, the grammar flawless, though she rarely used more than 10 words at a time with co-workers. No one at Argontech knew that Grace had once been a rising star in linguistics at the University of Nairobi, a top student with academic offers from Europe, Asia, and the US, with dreams of becoming a cultural liaison at the United Nations. Fluent in 9 languages by the time she was 22, she had co-authored a research paper on cross-cultural communication that was cited by professors in 4 countries. But then came the protests, the unrest, the bomb that ripped through a public university building, and the day she came home to find her younger brother missing, never seen again. Her activism caught the attention of the wrong people. Her professors advised her to leave. Her parents scraped together enough money for a one-way flight to New York, where she arrived with nothing but a suitcase, her degree, and a hope that her brilliance would be enough. But the American dream, she quickly learned, came with gatekeepers. Her Kenyan degrees were dismissed as non-equivalent. Every job interview ended with awkward smiles and promises to stay in touch. Applications to graduate programs were lost in bureaucracy or ignored without explanation. Rent bills piled up. Food ran low. Eventually, a friend told her of a cleaning job in Chicago with stable hours and decent pay. Grace took it, promising herself it would be temporary. She told herself she would work nights, study during the day, find someone to recognize her for what she could do. But as the months turned to years, she found herself stuck in survival mode, reading textbooks on her lunch breaks, saving every spare dollar, sometimes sending money back home to her aging parents. No one ever asked about the books she carried in her satchel, or why she corrected the spelling on printed flyers in the elevators. No one asked about the tiny notebook where she wrote down idioms she overheard in the hallway, so she could later translate them into multiple languages, and so she remained invisible, a ghost in the corporate machine. But every night, as she pushed her mop down empty hallways and wiped the fingerprints off whiteboards filled with half-erased business strategies, she reminded herself that knowledge never dies. She was still a linguist, even if no one cared. She was still the girl who could recite Russian literature and Chinese poetry from memory. She was still Grace Mwangi, daughter of teachers, sister to a boy whose voice she hadn't heard in years. She didn't need a title to prove it. And perhaps on some level she was waiting for someone to look up, to notice, to ask one simple question: what else can you do? Until then, she walked the halls with quiet dignity, a genius in janitor's clothes, humming verses, of Tagore while sweeping the remains of a CEO's catered lunch into a trash bin. It was a Wednesday evening, the kind where the city hummed with the promise of rain but never quite delivered, and inside Argontech's sprawling headquarters, the usual storm of deadlines and meetings had begun to settle into a tired, late-night lull. Grace Mwangi had just finished sanitizing the glass walls of the 21st floor conference rooms, her arms aching from hours of polishing, her headphones draped around her neck, softly playing an Arabic audiobook of The Prophet by Khalil Gibran. She preferred nights like these. The building was mostly empty, the echoes of the day finally faded, and she could recite poetry in Hindi under her breath without raising eyebrows. With her cart parked in a quiet corner of the executive lounge, Grace knelt to organize her supplies, unaware that just around the corner, a different kind of frustration was brewing. Ethan Cole, Argontech's notoriously driven CEO, was pacing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the adjoining boardroom, furiously typing on a tablet, cursing under his breath in a mix of English and the occasional stab at Spanish. At 42, Ethan was the kind of executive who never slept, never delegated anything involving foreign partners, and never accepted failure, even from himself. He was preparing for an emergency video conference with investors from China, Brazil, France, and India, and his assistant, Sarah, who usually handled translations, had called in sick with the flu just hours before. The presentation, a critical quarterly pitch involving 3 new product rollouts and an aggressive global expansion plan, needed to be translated into 5 languages by morning. Ethan, always convinced he could do everything himself, had tried to use Google Translate, but the results were embarrassing. Idioms butchered, tone completely off, and technical phrases rendered in hilariously broken grammar. He slammed the tablet down on the marble table. "Damn it, this is a disaster," he muttered, massaging his temple, unaware that his voice carried out into the hallway. Grace, just finishing aligning a stack of magazines on the executive lounge coffee table, paused. She had overheard enough to know what was going on, and against her better judgment, something inside her stirred. A voice she had long silenced, whispering, "Say something. Help him." But she hesitated. In her 3 years cleaning Argontech's offices, she had never once approached a C-suite executive. The janitorial code was unspoken but ironclad. Be invisible, be silent, be fast. Yet there was something in Ethan's voice, not arrogance this time, but desperation. She stood slowly, wiped her hands on her uniform, and stepped cautiously to the edge of the boardroom doorway. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly. Ethan spun around, startled to see her standing. "There, yes?" he said, eyes narrowing slightly, not unkindly but clearly impatient. Grace hesitated again. "I overheard. You're trying to translate your presentation?" He blinked. "Yes, into 5 languages. Badly." He gestured toward the tablet, in disgust. "I'm out of time and patience." Grace nodded, voice still calm. "If you'd like, I can help." Ethan tilted his head. "Help? With translation?" "Yes," she said simply. "Which languages?" "French, Mandarin, Spanish, Arabic, and Russian," he replied, more as a challenge than an answer. Grace offered a small, steady smile. "I can do all 5. A moment of silence stretched between them as Ethan studied her, half sure he had misheard. "You're saying you speak all those languages?" She nodded. Fluently. He laughed, a short, incredulous sound. Are you serious? Yes, sir. And you work here as a janitor? Yes, sir. He looked her up and down, confusion, disbelief, and curiosity warring on his face. He was too pragmatic to waste time doubting. Fine, he said at last, handing over the tablet. Let's see what you can do. Grace took the device with reverence, quickly scanning the English text. Within seconds, her mind began segmenting it, converting technical jargon into clean, culturally sensitive phrasing, avoiding idiomatic pitfalls, rephrasing marketing buzzwords into something appropriate for international investors. She didn't just translate, she interpreted, adapted, reshaped. First was the French version, elegant and formal. Then Spanish with a dynamic tone for South American clients. The Mandarin version avoided slang and preserved Confucian cultural norms around hierarchy and group achievement. The Arabic draft flowed from right to left with perfect script formatting, and the Russian was direct, respectful, and technically precise. Ethan watched her fingers move across the screen, almost in disbelief. Within an hour, she returned the tablet, now organized with labeled sections, each one complete and polished. Done, she said quietly. Ethan blinked, scrolling through them. That's impossible, he murmured, skimming the Arabic, frowning in concentration, then nodding slowly as he recognized the correct phrasing he'd heard on past business trips to Dubai. He switched to the Mandarin, no errors. French? Perfect tenses. He looked up. You did all of this just now? Grace nodded. Yes, sir. He stared at her for a long moment, silence falling heavy in the room. For once, the CEO, who always had a plan, who always expected answers, had none. How do you know all these languages? Grace's voice was still modest, but steady. I studied linguistics, back home, before coming to the US. Where's home? Kenya. He blinked again. And you just work here cleaning floors? It's the job that was available, she said. I needed to work, and no one asked about my degrees. Ethan sat down slowly, staring at the screen. This is beyond professional. This is world-class. Grace didn't reply. She didn't need to. Her work spoke for itself. After another pause, Ethan looked up again, his expression now unreadable. Do you have a resume? He asked. Not one that matters, she said quietly. Not here. But something had shifted. In that moment, Ethan Cole, driven, impatient, brilliant Ethan, saw something he had never expected to see in a night shift janitor. Genius. Real, disciplined, untapped genius. And for the first time in years, he was at a loss. Not because of a mistake, but because someone had just rewritten what he believed possible within his own walls. Grace, sensing the conversation was over, turned to leave. Wait, he said. She stopped. Can you come back tomorrow afternoon? He asked. To meet some people, our language team, and maybe HR. Grace blinked. I work nights. Not anymore, he said, almost absently, his mind already racing with possibilities. Starting tomorrow, I want you in the daylight. Grace looked at him for a long time, then gave a quiet nod. Yes, sir. And with that she walked away down the hallway she had cleaned for years, her steps slow and composed. But behind her, the entire course of her life had just shifted. Unbeknownst to her, the moment had been seen, not by the building's cameras, not by the security guards, but by fate itself. And it would not forget. The next day unfolded with an electric tension neither Grace Mwangi nor Ethan Cole could have anticipated, as if the very air inside Argon Tech had shifted its tone overnight. The halls were still polished, the offices still buzzed with the familiar cadence of ringing phones and keyboard taps, but there was a subtle undercurrent, a current only the few most perceptive could feel, that something hidden had been unearthed and for the first time recognized. Grace arrived precisely at 2:30 p.m., wearing a simple but elegant dark blue blouse and slacks, her janitor's uniform left at home, her ID badge turned backward on the lanyard so it wouldn't give away the role she had played for the last 3 years. She stepped into the executive elevator for the first time, not as someone riding it between janitorial duties, but as a guest invited by the company's highest office. Her heart beat hard against her ribs, not from nerves, but from something closer to defiance, a quiet and powerful knowing that this moment had always been hers, long before anyone else saw it. When the elevator doors opened onto the 35th floor, she was greeted not by HR as she had expected, but by Ethan himself, standing in front of the glass conference room with 3 senior executives behind him: Carla Remy, head of global communications; Devon Lai, director of international strategy; and Lena Barakat, head of product localization. Each of them had been given a copy of the translations Grace had completed the night before, though her name had been omitted from the files. "Come in," Ethan said simply, his voice unreadable, professional but tinged with the slightest edge of anticipation. Grace nodded and walked inside, the room's vast windows framing the skyline behind her as if she had stepped onto a stage. "This," Ethan said, motioning to the papers, "is some of the finest translation work our team has seen, and none of it came from our usual consultants." A flicker of confusion crossed Carla's face. "Who did it, then?" Ethan smiled. "She did." All eyes turned to Grace. Lena looked her up and down, clearly processing what she'd just heard. "You translated these?" she asked, tapping the Mandarin version with her red nail. "Yes," Grace replied evenly. "All of them." Devon leaned forward. "Where did you study?" "University of Nairobi," she answered. "Double. Degree in linguistics and comparative literature. I had scholarships lined up for Oxford and McGill, but life took another path." Carla, skeptical but curious, folded her arms. "So if we spoke to you in Russian right now—" Grace didn't. "Wait." In flawless Moscow-accented Russian, she answered, "Yes, you may speak to me in Russian. I understand it completely." Devon raised an eyebrow. Carla, who had spent years stationed in Brussels, switched to French, rapid, formal, and with idiomatic expressions meant to throw off casual speakers. Grace responded instantly, her words not only correct but culturally appropriate, her delivery elegant and natural. Lena leaned forward, smiling slightly, and began speaking to her in formal Arabic, a dialect only the well-educated in the Middle East used. Grace's reply flowed smoothly, touching all the correct grammatical constructs, her pronunciation almost indistinguishable from that of a native speaker from Amman or Beirut. The room fell silent for a moment, as each executive glanced at the others, a shared look of disbelief turning quickly to intrigue. "How many languages do you speak?" Carla finally asked. 9, Grace replied. "Swahili, French, Spanish, Mandarin, Arabic, Portuguese, Russian, Hindi, and English, though I've dabbled in German and Farsi." Devon chuckled. "Dabbled." Ethan watched all of this unfold with a quiet satisfaction, but he wasn't finished. "Let's make this real," he said, pulling out a small speaker and placing it on the table. "We're going to run a simulated scenario, real-time interpretation, if you're okay with that." Grace nodded, calm and centered. For the next 40 minutes, Ethan played back live recordings of past Argon Tech investor calls and international meetings, fast-paced dialogue in multiple languages, peppered with regional slang, obscure references, and industry-specific jargon. Grace listened, took minimal notes, and then proceeded to translate not just accurately but contextually, changing terms where cultural adaptation was needed, adjusting tone when hierarchy or diplomacy required it, and even offering suggestions on how certain concepts could be localized more effectively. At one point, Lena leaned back in her chair, clearly impressed. "She's not just translating," she said to the others. "She's localizing, interpreting tone, correcting for cultural gaps. This is native-level strategic communication. It's like we've been paying consultants 10 times what she can do in one sitting." Carla turned to Grace. "Have you ever worked in communications before?" "No," Grace said. "Not formally, but I studied communication theory. And languages are tools of connection. I believe in understanding more than words. I believe in context, intention, nuance." Ethan finally spoke again. "Would you be willing to take a position here, full-time, as part of our global team?" Grace blinked. "You're offering me a position?" "I'm offering you a future," he replied, his voice low and firm. "One that matches your ability." The others nodded. Devon added, "We've been hiring overpriced firms to do work that you just did better. We'd be fools not to bring you on." Grace hesitated, not out of doubt, but from the sheer weight of what this moment represented. She thought of her parents, of the professors who once believed in her, of the little notebook she carried, still tucked in her satchel, where she'd written her dreams in 10 languages and crossed out nearly all of them. And now, suddenly, she was being invited to reclaim them. "What would my title be?" she asked quietly. "That's up to you," Ethan said. "But we'll start with Director of Global Communications, reporting directly to me." Grace inhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "And the janitor position?" "Already reassigned," he said. "You don't clean floors anymore, Grace." She didn't cry, though her chest tightened in a way that felt close. She simply nodded. "Then I accept." And in that instant, something unspoken passed between them all. An acknowledgement that they had almost missed her, that her brilliance had nearly gone to waste, not because it lacked value, but because no one had looked beneath the surface. Grace left the conference room with her head high, not as a guest, not as an exception, but as a leader. And every employee who saw her walk through the office that day noticed something different about her, though they couldn't quite say what. Maybe it was the way she moved with deliberate grace and quiet strength. Maybe it was the calm in her eyes that suggested she had always known this moment would come, even if the world had forgotten her. Or maybe, just maybe, it was that for the first time someone who had always been extraordinary was finally being seen that way. It had been exactly 94 days since Grace Mwangi transitioned from janitor to Director of Global Communications at Untold. Yet in many ways, it felt like she had never truly belonged anywhere else, as though she had always been meant to sit at the long glass tables where strategy was sculpted, where partnerships were born, where words were not merely tools but levers capable of moving entire markets. Though now, when she passed her old cleaning cart in the supply closet on the basement floor, she still paused for a moment, not in shame but in honor, a silent nod to the journey she had taken, and to the thousands like her who had yet to be seen. The early days of her promotion were both electrifying and exhausting. Each morning she walked into meetings where people still blinked when she introduced herself, some visibly recalibrating their mental model of who she was, some trying to mask the awkwardness of knowing they had walked past her 100 times, without ever learning her name. But Grace was not interested in resentment or revenge. She had no time for that. Instead, she poured herself into the work with a ferocity and precision that made even the most skeptical executives fall silent. She rewrote the company's entire international communications playbook, replacing tired templates with linguistically authentic narratives, stripping away marketing fluff, and instead threading in culturally intelligent storytelling that actually resonated with Untold's partners and customers around the world. French clients no longer received lazy Parisian dialects, but regionally sensitive versions that acknowledged differences between Quebec, Dakar, and Marseille. Mandarin proposals were not just translated, but rewritten to reflect Chinese business etiquette, including proper hierarchical structures and even poetic metaphors for innovation, which Grace had picked up from her time reading Tang Dynasty verse during night shifts. And when the company launched its biggest expansion initiative in Brazil and Egypt, it was Grace who flew to both locations, standing before high-level stakeholders and delivering presentations in Portuguese and Arabic with the quiet authority of someone who not only understood the languages, but the people behind them. Her rise became the talk of the company. Some whispered admiration, others quiet envy. But none could deny the results. Investor confidence rose, global retention rates improved, and Untold's international revenue jumped 17% in just one quarter, much of it attributed directly to Grace's new approach. Ethan Cole, once skeptical of anyone not vetted through Ivy League resumes and Silicon Valley pedigree, found himself increasingly relying on her, not just for language, but for strategy. "You don't just translate," he told her during one late-night debrief. "You see the shape of things before they form." She thanked him, though she already knew. Her grandfather back in Nairobi had once told her, The most powerful leaders are not those who speak the most, but those who listen until they can speak many truths at once. She had never forgotten it. One morning, HR requested she submit an updated biography for the executive website. Most execs wrote sterile blurbs listing degrees and roles. Grace wrote a brief, hauntingly beautiful paragraph that began with, "I was once invisible. Now I lead with language." It became the most viewed profile on the company's site within 48 hours. And then, as if fate were determined to test just how far she had truly come, a moment arrived that could have broken her or propelled her into something even greater. A European investor meeting was scheduled involving multiple governmentees, delegates, 5 different countries, and a live press segment, Untold's biggest international engagement yet. 2 days before the event, the external interpreter firm contracted for the meeting abruptly pulled out due to a labor dispute. Panic struck the executive team. Ethan's assistant offered to cancel the press portion. Others proposed shifting the event to English only and apologizing later. But Ethan said nothing. He simply looked at Grace. "Do you think you can handle this?" he asked, not as a challenge but as a colleague. 5 languages. Live. Grace closed her eyes for a moment. She thought of the nights scrubbing grout on her knees while reciting Urdu poetry. She thought of her mother singing Swahili lullabies while braiding her hair. She thought of the man who once told her, "You don't clean floors anymore, Grace." Then she opened her eyes. "I've already started rehearsing," she said. The day of the event arrived like a drumbeat. Camera crews, polished suits, earpieces, coffee carts, flags. Grace wore a dark green silk blouse and a simple gold chain, her hair braided back in a low bun. She stood in the center of the room with nothing but a tablet and her mind. As the event began, she switched languages like wind through open windows, greeting in Russian, clarifying in French, translating a question from Hindi to Arabic, then giving the English summary with such calm authority that the entire room began leaning forward every time she opened her mouth. When a Brazilian delegate joked mid-sentence using a colloquialism referencing samba politics and subtle corruption, Grace didn't flinch. She smiled, translated it as a delicate dance of mutual interest, and the entire room laughed. Ethan sat at the back, watching her work, watching the way she turned noise into meaning, watching the world realize what he had almost missed. The broadcast was streamed to 4 continents. Social media lit up. "Who is she?" became a trending phrase in corporate Twitter circles. 3 international publications requested interviews. By evening, Grace's name was on a short list for a global advisory board at the United Nations for Multilingual Diplomacy Initiatives. Yet through all this, she remained grounded. After the event, she didn't go to the after-party on the rooftop lounge. She walked to the company cafeteria and sat quietly, eating lentils and rice alone, grateful, tired, and calm. It was there that Ethan found her. He sat down across from her without speaking for a moment. "You changed the company today," he finally said. "No," Grace replied. "You just finally saw what's been here all along." Ethan looked at her, nodded, and then asked something he had never asked another executive before. "What do you think we should do next?" She looked out the window, the skyline twinkling. "Hire people who've been overlooked," she said. "Stop assuming talent comes in one shape or shade or school. Go back to the people we've ignored. There's gold in the shadows." Ethan nodded slowly. "Will you lead that initiative?" Grace smiled. "I already am." And with that, Grace Mwangi, once a forgotten janitor polishing floors at midnight, became more than a symbol, more than a story. She became the architect of a new kind of corporate language, one where power listened, where leadership translated not just between dialects, but between worlds. And for every immigrant cleaning an office after hours, every woman with a PhD, folding laundry to survive, every genius hidden behind silence, she had cracked open the door, not all the way, but just enough